I wear three hats. My first hat began some 19 years ago, where I believe and I think that I was the first woman to graduate from CIT in Wellington in the Certificate of Embalming. Sorry. I believe that was 19 years ago. I had a huge cultural shock when I went to CIT, and I can speak to that later. My second hat is quite different from that. I now coordinate the Lilac study, which with Auckland University is studying life and living in advanced age. So we interview Māori between the age of 80 and 90. My third hat is, and one I'm extremely passionate about, and tautoko Norman's kōrero this morning is I am a panel member on the advisory panel in Rotorua to our SIFs. Now, we're the only external group that Child, Youth and Family have some form of accountability to. So there is a lot of awhi I have for Norman about intergenerational transfer and how we see that coming down the line.
Suicide found me in 1986 when my brother ended his life after a period of years as a drug dealer with Mr. Asia Network. He died over in Australia, and so there was a long journey of lobbying, trying to bring him home so we could bury him. He died 5 days before Christmas 1985. So it was a big kaupapa trying to get somebody to sign this bit of paper that would bring our brother home. I wrote the Kia Piki Te Oro o Te Tai Tamariki, the first Māori suicide prevention strategy. What we got with that strategy was not what we wanted. What we wanted was a strategy that would address suicide amongst our people across the whole lifespan, from a whakapapa base, based on the principles of self-determination or the reclamation of tino rangatiratanga. What we ended up with was a very limited version of a program that had been happening over in Canada, in Alaska. I've been all around the world working in suicide prevention in Indigenous populations, and in 9 days' time I'm submitting my doctorate, which is the role of hapu in suicide prevention, because you can't talk about suicide prevention and self-determination. They are codependent. They are one and the same thing, I believe. So 9 days I'll go submit that, and the analysis is of historical trauma coming down through the generations in our whakapapa and its impact on suicide, drug and alcohol, on loss of hope and despair. So with the purpose of soul healing, or healing the wounded, the mamai in our spirits as a people.
Kia ora tātou. My name is Maui Te I hail from Te Urewera University. The campus I belong to is in Te Waimana. Most of my professors were all non-English speaking, so I definitely pay homage to them, because they taught us another world view. So my role is one of them is I'm a translator, whereby I translate old people's stories to young ears, and just as important, young people's stories to old ears. So we walk in a two-world view, and I suppose since I've been at this hui, I've just found me an official tag, which is I'm a 21st century tohunga.
Kia ora tātou, ko Māpuhi Raharuhi ahau. I live in the sweet spot of Otara Marae, kei Ngāti Pikiao, kei Wanganui a Ngāti Pikiao, and I'm a Kia Piki Te Ora coordinator. I've also just completed an eight-month wānanga on Te Whakaurora, which is an absolutely wonderful resource for Māori suicide prevention and those that are working within Māori suicide prevention at a strategic level, but also very relevant to our whānau hapu e niui. Kia ora.
I have a question for Karen. As an embalmer, there's something that happens to our whānau that I think we need to discuss in this room, post-suicide. When my husband suicided, after I buried him and returned from the tangi, I got a letter from the coroner telling me that they had removed body parts and that I had 6 days in which to get the return of those body parts, and I needed to do that in writing. Now, when you are going through the trauma of suicide, that is one huge thing. My children were put through the absolute horror of digging back to their father's grave in order to rebury what had been taken from him with no consultation with me or the whānau. And I think it's a discussion that needs to be had amongst this panel.
19 years ago, when I went to CIT, I was astounded at some of the practices from a Māori perspective. Now, in Rotorua, where I can only speak to Rotorua because that's where I trained and that's where I came from. So in Rotorua, we did things so well that I didn't question that other people didn't do them. So that my cultural shock was that there were office hours. I'm going to start from the beginning, So we didn't have that in Rotorua. When we got rung, we were there and we did what the whānau needed doing at their request. I'm shocked now that in Rotorua we no longer have a pathologist. And as a funeral director and embalmer, we became like the facilitator between the pathologist, the coroner, and the family. So if you're intuitive enough and you're Māori, you know who to sit down with and you know who to explain those processes to. And you would do that to the best of your ability because you only get one shot of it. And that's when I've ever spoken to groups about funeral directing or embalming, you get one shot. Like you said, there's no comeback, and the healing process for us begins at that point. So we have to get it right. So that's the perspective I came from, being Māori and being a Māori woman, and that I think naturally for Māori women that healing process begins. Tangi Wetor was spoken about this morning. So that's the perspective I came from. I believe now that we are becoming so much like, I'm going to try and compare it, I don't know, Mike, if you agree with me here, Australia, where in that process you line up and you take your turn. And it saddens me to think that we had such a good process going, but because of policy, bureaucracy and resourcing and funding, that's no longer available to our people. Our people have to go to Hamilton, they wait in line for a pathologist. Who has the time to do it? Okay, that can take hours and sometimes a day or so. Now, we never had that, so we're going backwards. We're not going forward, and it saddens me. It saddens me that you actually had to go through that process.
If I could ask anyone in this room who have had similar experiences, I would like to know, because I'm taking this to the Treaty of Waitangi, taking the Coroner's Act to the Treaty of Waitangi, really on those types of things, body parts being held back without the knowledge of the family. There are a couple of other things that I'm taking to the Treaty of Waitangi, tribal, for them to do something about the legislation, and I'm thinking of doing the same with the funeral directors, because they have their own policies, and where's our right as human beings to be able to follow the process as we want to or when we want to. Because it stops at their door and you go back, you receive them in the casket and that type of thing.
I'd like to direct my question to Kerry. Developing your Māori suicide strategy and action plans, how did you incorporate wairuatanga into your action plans?
This has been a 35-year journey for me. And way back in the 80s when I spoke to people like Moana Jackson, Hana Tukukino, Tamiiti, and others who were actively involved in the sovereignty movement, the whakaaro then was around healing of the spirit, that there had been things that went down in our whakapapa, all of us, in our history in this land, pre and post colonisation, but we were concerned with the denigration of our culture, our practices around tangihana, wairua, the role of the tangiweto, which is, you know, in my own background, that's who my kuia was, that's who her kuia was. We were tangiweto, we had that role in our hapu. And so then we drafted a strategy. What we got in the end was not what we wanted. What we sought was very, very watered down. What we ended up with was a very, very watered down, compromised version that basically was a bastardisation of our tikanga, came through the filter of government policy processes that told me that we cannot look to the government to be the big solution. So then I went overseas and looked around and saw what tangata whenua were doing in Alaska, travelled through the villages in rural Alaska, in Hawaii, in other parts of the United States to look at their programs, all around the healing of the spirit, all around as a collective process, all around the analysis of the impacts of colonisation and what it took from us, all around the re-establishment of those of our healing traditions, and I believe that that knowledge is still out there. And I don't see it as a fait accompli, as a foregone conclusion that we can't reclaim our practices around tangihana. We can reclaim this knowledge, we can re-establish these practices. And so 35 years on, my focus is different, and it is on healing the soul wounds of history. Historical trauma, you can track it. You can track it in whakapapa lines, you can track it in your hapu, you can track it in your whānau, but we have to be honest with ourselves about that mamae. My PhD mahi was in my own hapu, and there's a vested interest by some of our hapu leadership around keeping the lid on that kōrero. You know, we're not going to achieve this if we keep silencing it and silencing it and silencing it. You know, I discovered 6 generations of sexual abuse in one of my hapu. That, to me, says that there is a massive suicide risk in my hapu. 23 young kids from 3 years of age, just at Christmas gone by, were sexually abused from 3 years of age. The oldest was 14, you know, by 2 of their brothers and cousins, boys and girls, raped and sexually abused. If we are not prepared to look at that history honestly, to look at how that situation has evolved in 2011, then, you know, we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other in the spirit of aroha and the spirit of healing our spirits, our wounded spirits, and in the spirit of getting on with our lives in a very positive and self-determining way.
My question is, I think a lot of us actually accept that there's this wairua that comes with us, and that's why some of the things happen to some of our tamariki mokopuna. My question is, where do we find these tohunga? There's one up there, I hear, tohunga to help us with our mahi.
In essence, you know when you're in your whānau that there is an emerging leadership that sits in your whānau. I know that when we're talking about whakamomori, when we're talking about suicide, there are 2 kaumātua that speak on it and have done a fair bit of background into that particular kōrero. And so to a large degree, they've been able to stand really at those tangis and put that kōrero out there. And just like the tangi weto process that we talk about, you know, when we were kids, you sort of watch the queer and they're having a bit of a laugh. Next minute, the manuhiri come in and away they go. Now, I know that for us, it was almost a standing joke that my older sister had these two different natures, one to katakata and the other one to tangi. But I still remember our grandmother teaching her that kaupapa. And so there's these kind of three important things, you know, you align yourself with your kaumātua, your queer, and others who sit out there to be able to support you. And there is no doubt in my mind that as you look at your hapu, your whānau, there are these emerging men and women, and even young adults who get to speak to a particular kaupapa. And I want to kind of provide, I guess, a forum for this. We need to be brave enough to step up and do the kōrero. And I'm thinking of going back home, and this woman, she was 39, who said, "You see that kaumātua there? He started abusing me," and I went, "Oh," you know, and I said, "So have you reported him? Have you spoken to him?" "No, I don't know. I just decided to talk about it now." And she gave me this incredible story. Now, I decided that I would go and sit beside him and quietly talk, and I said, you know, and was able to say to him, "That woman there has just told me about this situation. So we need to come and have a kōrero." And we held a process within our hapu to talk about it, and he never spoke for quite a period of time on the taumata again. But there was also a whole lot of processes to kind of get that stuff healed. So in a sense, there are people that are identified, whether they're men, women, or even, well, really young adults who step up and say, "You the one," you know, and we know who those emerging people are in that particular hapu. And I think the time has come really to add your voice, and to add your voice in a way that is significant, that will make a difference, that will identify who those specific leaders are out there. You know, and they don't come in the form of a kaumātua, or it could come as a young adolescent who has been abusing for quite a period of time. And so we need to be watchful when we go and work with our hapu. We know those things are alive and kicking. And like you, we found it in our own family. And everybody came back from all over the world. And the response that I saw as we discussed the issue around abuse and that type of thing, someone had to step up and say, we need to take this actually further, so that we can stamp it out and draw a line in the sand that from here on in, ka whakawāte o ki te hualahi mō tātou, you know.
Each generation has its kaumātuas, has its tohungas. Now, in the traditional sense, you were selected, chosen, and trained. Nowadays, well, you go to university now. So, what I'm just following up on Rawiri's is the fact that to have a look at it from another perspective is that we may need to have a look at examining words like kaumātua and words like tohunga. Exactly what is a tohunga and what is the difference between a tohunga and a kaumātua? Because each have a respective role and a duty. For the sake of tohunga, well, my limited understanding of that is that you're a specialist in the field, whatever your field is. If you're a tohuna wairua mataki tēnei, well, you're a specialist in sort of the bump in the night stuff. if you're a tohunga whakairo, you're a specialist in your field. Now, those people were, well, they were valued, they were looked after, and likewise, they had a role to play. So, to answer your question, where do you find them? Well, in life. Eh, they could be around the corner, wherever. But the clues are there, the indicators. Every hapu has them, every iwi has them. So no matter what iwi you're from, you've got them, whether they be like from Dream Whenua Moimoia, they've got them. First Nations got them. So we've got them. So it's just a matter of just tying back into your tribal ways and into your hapu, and then the answers will come.
While we have these expertise in the things that we do, there is a set of principles that govern the way we need to behave, you know, in this whole process. And while we have those traditions and lines, there's still the issue of one's ability to be able to be trustworthy, to add value, all those types of things. Eh?
With the intermarriage amongst the Pākehās and the indigenous peoples, some of these children have two lives to live in. Pākehā way life says, oh, you've got to go this way. The Maori way life says, no, you've got to go this way. So what's the panel's view on that sort of thinking?
If you look at me, I'm probably the whitest tūhoi person you'll ever meet. So I kind of understand where you're coming from on this one. But however, is that we were taught to look at the world in a two-world view. That is, no matter what iwi you from, what indigenous nation on the planet, in a traditional sense, it was always looked at in a two-world view. There was always a physical reason why things happen. There was always a spirit reason why things happen. The unfortunate part today is we only look at the physical. Now, my Pākehā side taught me that one. But my Māori side taught me to look at the world in a spirit worldview. So if you're ranirua about your bloodline, well, the Māori DNA, which I like to call it, which is the Māori descendant, now ancestor, which is what we are, will always be there. And it's just your choice, because life gives you those choices. It's not to say no one's going to help, but the choice is yours, always has been.
From an Indigenous perspective in Australia, I mean, traditional marriages and arrangements were always a part of our society. But young people today, just as the brother said here, it's about choice. And people know each of those worlds and societies better than any of us here. And I think that people know how to walk within those and to respect that. And if they don't respect that, there's always a mechanism, whether it comes from the community, that then sorts out whether those things need to be dealt with. So it is like in any society. There are rules, social structures, everyone knows their place. We don't need textbooks to help us understand our own culture. People live it and practice it, and if it's not correct, then people address it accordingly.
I'll just add a piece of history from Western Canada. The Catholic clergy in the 17th century wanted to integrate the First Nations through the French colonial culture. So they favored intermarriage, for a while. But they didn't like it because the French colonizers were integrating to the other side. Oh, they got so frustrated. And it went well because the culture made so much sense, so much more sense than whatever European culture was then. But the French lost the war against the English, so that Catholic clergy, and I'm not anti-religious when I say this, it's just facts, and it's very much denied in Quebec still, but the Catholic clergy made a deal with the British, who won the war, and they separated all those families, saying, well, you got a choice. You're going to be on that side or on that side and forever. And then they even erased the First Nations names, everywhere. And you know what? Nobody talks about it. It's still a big, denial. But what I mean is, like, people were more than okay with it. It is, it's political and, other levels that were not okay with it.
we as Māori understand the concept of manaaki. And so manaaki, for me, is about understanding that whatever, wherever or whoever you are, my job is to ensure that when you are here, that it is my responsibility to make sure that you are okay. And these are some of, I think, Margaret Mitu's kōrero that she's just been talking about of recent. So I think too, partly it's about us understanding what the meaning of our kupu are in terms of not separating who and what we are and how we come about into to te ao nei. And so understanding what, for example, manaaki is, the whole hunutanga of that kupu. And it is about a responsibility that I have to others who may not be Māori as well.
I just want to respond from my role as a mum. My kids are, we're also Danish, Scottish and Samoan. And my kids, I encourage them to participate in two worlds, in a Pākehā world, and to take from that which those things that will provide opportunities for them in life, but never, ever to forget who they are and where they're from in terms of their whakapapa. There's been a whole pile of international research conducted by a woman called Teresa Laframboise. She's American Indian, and she has found that there's I don't know how to put this, a higher degree of resilience in American Indian youth who have competency, comfort, capability to walk those two worlds. But at the core of their being and their existence is an acknowledgement that who they are in terms of their kinship and their genealogical lines is important for their spirits. It's important for their identity. And we all know, hopefully we all know, about the relationship between suicide prevention and identity. That when you know who you are, you're less likely to end your life by suicide.
Having lost my mum to suicide in 2000, what have you done at home with your people to encourage them to talk, to get over the whakamā, to kōrero?
What's been happening in some communities is that some families are more ready than others because they desperately need to talk and to understand where all that comes from, while others, you know, probably like here and everywhere on the world, that things were done in a way, like I was saying this morning, for the families who were victimized eventually in the past, to even with the behaviors that we just talked about, like incest or sexual abuse, or of course we end up being so stigmatized, and now it's us the problem, and we're, you know, so that the burden of the shame that was forced on us has to be clearly identified, and each time a family touched by suicide has the courage to, or the need to find some meaning, they're helping everybody else in the community. It's a contagion, that freedom to acknowledge who we are and what we went through, and our behaviors that not so happy about are a direct consequence of all this. It helps a lot. Again, there is a contagion from family to family of, you know, just getting back to that freedom of honoring who you are and understanding what was forced on your people. And working on it, working on the behavior, but it's not the same if you acknowledge that all those behaviors that we're shameful of are also direct consequence of that oppression.
I'll answer it this way. We were taught that everybody, male or female, black, blue, brown and white, we were all given a wairua at a certain stage in one's life. Call it the 9-month journey. And at that time, the role of wairua, and it still is to protect you, because the Creator gave it in order to look after you, to help you live life and go through life. Now, without writing a book here. So, when you mentioned the word whakama, if anything, from our worldview, that's the killer. That's the real killer. That's the one that hardly anyone sees there. But that's the killer. And it's like a reo in a bread. It just keeps growing until you deal to it. And I think one of the, why I like this hui is talking about it, discussing it with like-minded people, getting different worldviews. He ora na rongoa tera. And the sister from Aussie, hey, I've got a ton of questions for her. And my understanding is that once we can pull out the whakama and work with it, and all I've done at home is working with, and mainly with the young ones, is be proud of who you are. Let's look at all these things that make us us, your uniqueness. And there's a start, eh? It's just, there's a start. And then as the dialogue continues, then you know, then you'll see where the whakama lies. Because that saying is still alive and well, mā te whakama ka patsu. And, well, I think you don't have to tell many Māoris about that one. But it's still alive and well, and it's just managing the dialogue with that. Oh no.
Hey, let's give it up for our panellists today, eh?